Welcome to Horror Camp. I know these videos are meant to help you drift off to sleep, but before you do, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe so you never miss another chilling tale. It started in the summer of 2005. A summer filled with hope, promise, and new beginnings, or so we thought. My mom, my little sister Lily, and I had been through a tough year. My dad had walked out on us, leaving my mom to pick up the pieces and try to rebuild our lives. She worked tirelessly day and night to make ends meet. So when we found the house, a big old place on the edge of town, with a price tag we could actually afford, it felt like a miracle, a gift. At first we didn't question why it was so cheap. We were too desperate, too eager to believe in the fresh start it promised us. It had character, creaky wooden floors, tall ceilings, and rooms that seemed to go on forever. It wasn't perfect, but it felt like we could finally breathe again. I still remember the way it felt the first time I walked inside. The air was thick, almost heavy, like it was pressing down on my shoulders. It didn't feel empty, even though it was. And then there were the little things. The strange smell like damp earth and something faintly metallic. The way the shadows in the corners seemed to linger just a little too long, even when the lights were on. My mom brushed it off, said it was an old house settling. I believed her for a while. But that house, it was alive. Not in the way a home feels, full of life and warmth. No, it was alive in the way a predator watches its prey. Quiet, patient, waiting. And here's the thing. We weren't just haunted while we were inside it. No, this house was different. This house didn't let us go. It followed us. And that's why I'm here now to tell you about it. To warn you. Because some houses aren't just places to live. They're traps. And once you've lived in one, it never really lets you leave. My mom, my younger sister Lily, and I had been through a rough patch. A really rough patch. My dad had walked out on us about a year earlier, and life had been one big scramble ever since. My mom was working long hours at a job that barely paid the bills, and I had to step up and help out with Lily more than I ever thought I'd need to. So, when we found the house, it felt like a godsend. It was big, way bigger than anything we'd ever lived in, and the price, almost too good to be true. My mom told me not to question it. It's just a blessing, she said, and we deserve it. And maybe we did. Maybe we really did deserve a fresh start. But looking back, I realized that the house, it wasn't a blessing. It was something else entirely. The day we moved in was hot and bright, the kind of summer day where the heat feels like it's sticking to your skin. I remember standing in the driveway, staring up at the house and feeling something. I couldn't put my finger on it at the time, but it wasn't excitement or relief. It was more like the house was staring back at me. It was old, with that kind of Victorian charm you'd expect to see on postcards. A wraparound porch, stained glass windows, and a tall, narrow structure that made it look like it belonged in another century. Lily loved it immediately. She ran up the steps, her little pink sneakers squeaking, and pressed her face against the front door. "It looks like a dollhouse," she squealed. Mom just smiled, but I noticed she was gripping her purse tightly, like she was nervous. "Go on," she said to me. "Open the door. Let's see our new home." I don't know why, but my hand hesitated on the doorknob. It felt cold. Not cool, like metal usually feels, but icy, like something had been holding it just before me. I shook off the thought and turned the knob. The house was beautiful in its own way, but it felt heavy. The air inside was thick, like the house had been holding its breath for years, and wasn't quite ready to let it out. At first, we were too busy unpacking to notice the little things. The movers were lugging boxes inside, Mom was barking orders, and Lily was darting from room, picking out the one she wanted for herself. But as the hours went on, that feeling didn't go away. It wasn't just me who noticed it either. "The walls are humming," Lily said suddenly. She was standing in the hallway, her head tilted to the side like she was listening to something only she could hear. Mom and I exchanged a glance, then laughed it off. "Old houses make weird noises," I told her. "It's probably the pipes." Lily didn't look convinced. "It doesn't sound like pipes," she muttered. Then she skipped off to explore another room. By the time evening rolled around, we were all exhausted. Mom ordered pizza, and we ate on the living room floor, surrounded by boxes. I remember laughing with Lily about how weird it felt to eat without a table. For a brief moment, it felt like maybe this house could really be home. But that night, as I lay in bed, staring up at the ceiling, I started to notice the little things. The creaks and groans of the house didn't sound random anymore. They sounded deliberate. And then I heard the footsteps. At first, I thought it was Mom, maybe walking around upstairs. But the rhythm was strange. Slow, steady, and heavier than her usual steps. They seemed to circle above me, moving from one end of the attic to the other. I told myself it was nothing, just the house settling, like everyone always says. But deep down, I didn't believe it. The next morning, Lily asked me if I heard the noises too. She said it sounded like someone was pacing in the attic, but when she told Mom, she just said it was squirrels. Lily didn't look convinced, and honestly, neither was I. But what were we supposed to do? We'd just moved in. This house was supposed to be our fresh start, and I didn't want to ruin it for Mom by freaking her out. So we ignored it. We ignored the footsteps, the creaks, and even the way objects seemed to disappear and reappear in the strangest places. Like the time Mom's keys went missing for an entire day, only to show up neatly placed in the center of the dining table, a table none of us had touched yet. Or the way Lily's favorite doll ended up at the bottom of the stairs, even though she swore she'd left it on her bed. The house was trying to get our attention, and little by little, it started to work. My best friend Jake lived just a few blocks away. We'd been inseparable since grade school, the kind of friendship where you could spend hours together doing nothing and still have the best time. When we moved into the house, Jake was the first person I invited over. He came that same afternoon, riding his beat-up bike up the driveway with a wide grin. "Man, this place is huge," he said, tossing his bike into the grass and jogging up the steps. "It's like something out of a movie." At first, Jake thought the house was cool. Creepy, sure, he teased me about the old creaky floors and the weird smell in the hallway, but he didn't seem scared. Not yet. That first visit was normal. We spent hours playing video games, eating snacks, and talking about the usual stuff: school, sports, the latest rumors going around the neighborhood. Jake didn't mention anything strange, and for a while, it felt like the house was just a house. But that changed the next time he came over. It was a rainy afternoon, the kind where the whole house feels dim no matter how many lights you turn on. Jake showed up with his backpack slung over one shoulder, dripping wet from the short ride over. "This place looks even creepier in the rain," he said, shaking water from his hair. I laughed it off, but deep down I couldn't shake the feeling that he was right. We were sitting in the living room, same as before, playing one of our favorite games. Jake was unusually quiet that day, his eyes darting around the room every so often. "What's up with you?" I asked, laughing. "You're acting like you've never been in an old house before." "It's nothing," he said, but his voice sounded uneasy. A few minutes later, he froze. Just stopped moving altogether. I glanced over at him, thinking he was messing with me, but his face was pale, his eyes wide and fixed on the corner of the room. "What?" I said, feeling a nervous laugh bubble up in my chest. "Who's that?" he whispered. The tone of his voice, low, shaky, made the hairs on my arms stand on end. I followed his gaze to the corner of the room, but there was nothing there. Just the empty corner where the shadows of the furniture met the walls. "I don't see anything," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Very funny, Jake." But he didn't laugh. He didn't even look at me. He just kept staring at that corner, his grip on the controller tightening until his knuckles turned white. "I'm serious," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "She's standing right there. A woman. She's wearing a long black dress, and she's staring at us." My heart skipped a beat. I turned back to the corner, my eyes straining to see what he was talking about. But there was nothing, just shadows and an old, empty lamp. "There's no one there," I said, my voice louder now, as if speaking with more confidence could make it true. Jake finally looked at me, his face pale and his eyes filled with something I can only describe as fear. "I swear I saw her," he said. "She was there." Jake didn't stay much longer after that. He tried to play it cool, but I could tell he was rattled. As he left, he turned to me and said, "There's something wrong with your house." I laughed it off, told him he was being dramatic, but deep down, his words stuck with me. That night, I tried to convince myself it was all just a misunderstanding. Maybe Jake had seen a shadow, or maybe his mind had been playing tricks on him. But then, as I lay in bed, staring at the dark ceiling, I started to wonder, what if he was right? Jake didn't come back after that. No matter how much I begged or tried to guilt him into visiting, he refused. "I'm not setting foot in that place again," he told me. I didn't want to admit it at the time, but I should have listened. Jake was the first person to see her, the woman in the black dress, but he wouldn't be the last. My mom worked late most nights, so it was usually just me and Lily at home during the evenings. We'd sit at the dining room table, eating dinner and talking about her day at school or what show she wanted to watch before bed. That night was no different, or at least it started out that way. We were eating pizza. I remember because Lily kept complaining about the crust being too crunchy, and I was teasing her about being picky. She was mid-sentence, arguing with me about how pizza should be made when she froze. Her fork clattered against her plate, and she just stared wide-eyed down the hallway. At first I thought she was playing a trick on me. "What now?" I asked, laughing nervously. But she didn't respond. Her gaze didn't move, her lips slightly parted as if she was about to speak but couldn't. Finally, she whispered, "Do you see that?" Her voice was so quiet, so shaky, that it sent a chill down my spine. I turned to look, my heart already racing even though I didn't know why. And that's when I saw it. It wasn't a shadow like you'd expect, cast by a person or a piece of furniture. No, this shadow stood on its own, unconnected to anything. It had a vague shape of head, shoulders, and arms, but no features, just darkness. We both sat there, frozen, unable to move or speak. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, every beat echoing in my ears. The shadow didn't move. It didn't lunge toward us or disappear immediately. It just stood there, watching, or at least, that's what it felt like it was aware of us. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the shadow began to change. It didn't vanish all at once. Instead, it melted slowly, sinking into the floor like ink spreading across paper. When it was gone, the hallway was empty again, but the air felt heavier, colder. Lily looked at me, her eyes wide with fear. "What was that?" she asked, her voice trembling. I don't know," I said. My voice sounded distant, like it didn't even belong to me. We didn't finish our dinner that night. We didn't even leave the dining room. We just sat there, staring at the hallway, waiting for something else to happen. When Mom got home, we told her everything. We described the shadow, how it moved, how it felt like it was alive. She listened, but I could see the doubt in her eyes. "It's an old house," she said, brushing it off. "Probably just your imagination. Maybe the light played tricks on you." But it wasn't the light. I knew that, and so did Lily. We begged her to check the hallway, to see for herself that something was wrong. She sighed and walked down the hall, flipping on the lights as she went. Nothing. Just the same creaky floorboards and peeling wallpaper we'd seen 100 times. "I think you two are just spooking yourselves," she said, smiling weakly. "You've been watching too many scary movies." But we hadn't, and we both knew what we saw. Mom went to bed early that night, leaving us alone in the living room. We tried to distract ourselves, turning on a comedy movie and curling up under blankets. But no matter how hard we tried, we couldn't forget the shadow. Every creak, every groan of the house made us jump. And then as we sat there in the dim glow of the TV, we heard it again. The footsteps. They were faint, coming from the attic above us. Slow, deliberate, and too heavy to be a squirrel or raccoon. Lily grabbed my arm, her fingers digging into my skin. "It's back," she whispered. I wanted to tell her she was wrong, that it was nothing. But I couldn't, because I knew she was right. For the next few days, nothing happened. It was almost enough to make me think we'd imagined the whole thing. Almost. But then, the following week, it was Mom's turn to see it. She was walking down the hallway late at night, heading to her room after finishing some work in the living room. She told us later that she felt like she wasn't alone, like someone was walking behind her. When she turned around, there it was. The shadow stood at the other end of the hallway, motionless but somehow menacing. She said it felt like it was staring at her, even though it didn't have eyes. She didn't freeze like we had. Instead, she backed away slowly, her heart pounding. But before she could reach her bedroom, the shadow melted into the floor, just like before. After that night, Mom didn't doubt us anymore. She didn't say it out loud, but we could tell by the way she avoided the hallway, by the way she triple-checked the locks on all the doors before going to bed. The shadow wasn't just a trick of the light. It wasn't our imagination. It was real. And it wasn't done with us yet. My mom had this antique mirror. It wasn't just any mirror, it was a family heirloom, passed down from her grandmother. She always said it had been in the family for over a century. The mirror was beautiful in a haunting sort of way. The frame was intricately carved, the silver tarnished just enough to make it look like it belonged in a museum. But what stood out most was the glass itself. It had a strange quality, almost like the reflection wasn't quite right. You'd look at yourself, but something about it always felt off. She hung it in the hallway, right outside her bedroom. It was her favorite piece in the house, her pride and joy. But after that night, none of us could even look at it the same way. It was late, probably close to midnight, when Mom got home from work. Lily and I were still awake, even though we were supposed to be in bed. We didn't even notice her come in at first. She walked past us without saying a word, her heels clicking softly against the hardwood floor as she headed toward her room. I remember thinking she looked exhausted, more so than usual. But then again, who wouldn't be? She was working non-stop to keep us afloat. Mom told us later that she didn't notice it right away. She was halfway down the hallway when she felt it, that prickling sensation at the back of your neck, like someone's watching you. She stopped, turned, and glanced into the mirror. At first, she thought it was just her own reflection. But then she looked closer, and that's when she saw it. Mom said it wasn't her face looking back at her. It was someone or something else, pale, hollow-eyed, and staring right at her. She froze, unable to move or even scream at first, but then the face, it smiled. That's when she screamed. I'd never heard my mom scream like that before. It wasn't just fear, it was raw, unfiltered terror. Lily and I ran to the hallway as fast as we could, but by the time we got there, it was already over. The mirror was shattered, pieces of glass scattered across the floor like jagged little stars. Mom was standing there, clutching her arms, tears streaming down her face. "What happened?" I asked, my voice shaky. She didn't answer at first. She just stared at the broken glass, her breathing shallow and rapid. Then she looked at me, and that's when I saw them. There were scratches on her arms, deep ones like someone or something had grabbed her. "I didn't touch it," she whispered. "I swear, I didn't touch it." She kept repeating it over and over, as if trying to convince herself more than us. But the scratches, they told a different story. Something had happened in that hallway, something none of us could explain. Mom didn't sleep that night. None of us did. We cleaned up the glass as best we could, but the frame of the mirror was still there, hanging on the wall like a hollow reminder of what had happened. Every time I walked past it, I felt like something was staring at me from the empty space where the glass used to be. After that night, Mom didn't try to brush things off anymore. She didn't tell us it was just our imagination or blame it on the house settling. She believed us now. But believing didn't make it stop. The house seemed different after the mirror shattered. The air felt heavier, colder. The noises at night grew louder, more deliberate. And the scratches, they didn't stop with Mom. Lily woke up one morning with faint red marks on her arms, like someone had been holding her too tightly while she slept. And me, I started having nightmares about the mirror, dreams where I'd see that pale face staring at me, its hollow eyes following me wherever I went. We wanted to take the mirror out of the house, to throw it away or burn it. But every time we tried, something stopped us. Mom said it felt like the frame was bolted to the wall, even though it wasn't. Eventually we gave up. We left it there, broken and empty, as if the house wouldn't let us get rid of it. And that's when we realized the mirror wasn't just a mirror. It was a window. And something on the other side was watching us. By this point, we were all on the same page. Staying in that house was no longer an option. My mom, my sister Lily, and I had been through too much. The footsteps, the shadows, the scratches, and that horrifying mirror. It all felt like the house was trying to push us out, to break us. But as it turned out, leaving wasn't going to be that simple. We planned to leave the next morning, as soon as the sun came up. Mom had already spoken to the landlord, told him we'd found somewhere else. We didn't care about breaking the lease or getting our deposit back. We just wanted out. The house, however, had other plans. That night, everything changed. It started small. The lights flickered a couple of times, the way they always did when the house wanted our attention. Mom sighed, muttering about bad wiring as she got up to check the breaker. But then the flickering turned into something else. The lights didn't just flicker, they dimmed, then flared so brightly it felt like the bulbs would explode. And then, all at once, they went out completely, plunging the entire house into darkness. I turned on the flashlight on my phone, trying to keep my voice calm as I called out, "Mom, Lily, are you okay?" Mom answered from the kitchen, her voice tense but steady. "I'm fine. Check on Lily." I headed toward the stairs, the beam of my flashlight bouncing off the walls as I went. But then I heard the sound that made my blood run cold. The footsteps in the attic were back, louder and more frantic than ever before. They didn't sound like a single person anymore, it sounded like a crowd, stomping and running in every direction. Lily screamed from upstairs, a sound so raw and terrified it made my stomach drop. I ran up the stairs 2 at a time, shouting her name, but the closer I got to her room, the colder the air became. It was freezing, so cold I could see my breath, even though it was the middle of summer. When I reached Lily's room, I saw her sitting on her bed, trembling. Her face was pale, her eyes fixed on the foot of the bed. "She's here," Lily whispered, her voice barely audible. I followed her gaze, and that's when I saw her. The woman Jake had described, the one in the long black dress, was standing there, her face pale and hollow, her eyes empty and cold. She was smiling, but it wasn't a smile of kindness. It was a smile of possession, of triumph. I wanted to move, to grab Lily and run, but I couldn't. My legs felt like they were rooted to the floor. And then, just as suddenly as she appeared, she was gone. That was the moment the house lost its subtlety. It didn't just want to scare us anymore, it wanted to trap us. Doors slammed shut, one after another, as if the house was trying to seal us in. The air was filled with whispers, dozens of voices all speaking at once. I couldn't make out what they were saying, but it didn't matter. It felt like the house itself was screaming at us to stay. Mom was in the living room, trying to open the front door, but it wouldn't move. It was like the house had locked it from the inside. She pulled and yanked, her knuckles turning white, but it wouldn't budge. And then the walls started shaking. At first it was subtle, like the vibrations of a distant earthquake. But then it grew stronger, until it felt like the whole house was going to collapse. Pictures fell from the walls, the sound of glass shattering echoing through the chaos. We didn't know what to do. We just stood there frozen as the house tore itself apart around us. We stayed together, huddled in the living room, too afraid to move. The whispers were so loud now, like a chorus of voices all shouting in a language we couldn't understand. And then, as suddenly as it started, it stopped. The house fell silent. The whispers, the footsteps, the shaking walls, all of it just stopped. The air was still, but it didn't feel calm. It felt like the house was waiting, watching, deciding what to do next. As soon as the sun came up, we packed what we could and left. We didn't bother taking everything, just the essentials. We didn't even say goodbye to the neighbors. When we drove away, I looked back at the house one last time. It stood there, silent and still, but I could feel it watching us. We thought it was over. We thought leaving the house would be the end of it. But we were wrong. The story doesn't end there. After we moved, we thought it was over. We thought we'd left it all behind, the shadows, the whispers, the cold, suffocating presence that seemed to live in every corner of that house. For a while, things felt normal, peaceful even. The new house was everything the old one wasn't, bright, warm, and filled with light. For the first time in months, it felt like we could breathe again. But peace, as we soon learned, is fragile, and whatever we had escaped from, it hadn't let us go. It started small, the way it always does. One morning, Lily woke up with scratches on her arms. They weren't deep, but they were enough to scare her. Mom tried to brush it off, saying she'd probably scratched herself in her sleep. But Lily was adamant. It wasn't me, she said, her voice trembling. It was her. When I asked who she was talking about, Lily just shook her head and refused to say another word. I didn't press her. Deep down, I think I already knew. It wasn't just Lily. Mom started hearing whispers again, but this time they followed her to work. She told me she could hear them during meetings, in the hallways, even in her car on the drive home. She said they were louder now, more insistent, like they were calling her name, begging her to come back. And me, I started dreaming about the house. In my dreams, I'd find myself standing at the front door of the old house. The air was always cold, the sky above me gray and lifeless. I'd push the door open, and it would creak the way it always did. Inside, the house was empty. No furniture, no boxes, just shadows. But the footsteps were still there, circling the attic above me, growing louder with every step I took. I'd walk through the rooms, following the whispers. They always led me to the same place, the hallway where the mirror used to hang. In my dreams, the mirror was whole again, its glass smooth and polished, the frame gleaming like it had been freshly cleaned. But the reflection wasn't mine. It was her. The woman in the black dress. She'd stand there, her hollow eyes staring back at me, that same twisted smile on her face. And then she'd speak, her voice soft and cold. Why did you leave? I woke up every time, gasping for air, my heart pounding so hard I thought it would burst. But the dreams stayed with me, like they were more than just dreams. And then, things started happening in the new house. Objects began to move on their own. Doors that we knew we'd locked would swing open in the middle of the night. Pictures fell from the walls, their glass frames shattering on the floor. One night we heard footsteps on the stairs, the same deliberate, heavy steps we'd heard in the old house. We all froze, too scared to even breathe. And then the whispers started again. Louder this time, more aggressive. They filled the entire house, coming from everywhere, and nowhere all at once. It felt like the old house was trying to pull us back. Like it couldn't stand the thought of us leaving it behind. One night, Lily woke up screaming. When I ran to her room, she was sitting up in bed, pointing at the foot of her bed. "She's here," Lily cried. "She's here." I turned, but there was nothing there. At least, not that I could see. But I could feel it, the cold, suffocating presence that had followed us from that house. It was back. Mom told me she felt like she was losing her mind. She said she couldn't escape the feeling that we were being watched, even when we were alone. I thought leaving would fix everything, she said, but it didn't, did it? I didn't know what to say. How do you tell someone that the thing haunting you isn't tied to a place, it's tied to you? The house didn't just haunt us while we were in it. It had followed us, clinging to us like a shadow we couldn't shake. And to this day, I feel like it's still watching. Every now and then, I'll see something out of the corner of my eye, a shadow that moves when it shouldn't, or a flicker of light in a darkened room. And sometimes, late at night, I'll hear it. The footsteps. The whispers. They're quieter now, more distant. But they're still there, waiting, watching, reminding me that some things can't be escaped. So, now you know. This isn't just a ghost story, it's my life. For a long time, we believed we'd never escape the nightmare. The house had followed us, its presence lurking in the corners of our lives, threatening to pull us back into its darkness. But we were stronger than we thought. We didn't give in to the fear. We didn't let it control us. Instead, we fought back the only way we knew how, by reclaiming our lives, piece by piece. It didn't happen overnight. At first, the whispers and shadows were constant, a reminder of everything we'd been through. But we refused to let them win. We filled our home with light, laughter, and love. Mom started taking weekends off to spend more time with us. Lily joined a local art club and filled the house with her colorful drawings. And me? I started writing everything down, every detail of what we'd experienced, every fear, every moment of courage. Writing helped me understand that the house only had power over us because we let it. The fear, the anger, the uncertainty, it fed on those feelings. But once we let them go, the house lost its grip. I've come to realize that the house wasn't just a place. It was a test, a reminder of how strong we could be when we stood together. We didn't just survive, we overcame. And now, as I write this, I feel a sense of peace I haven't felt in years. Some memories will always linger, like shadows at the edge of a bright day. But they don't define us. We define us. And as I look around at my family, at the laughter, the love, the light, I know we finally found our way back to the life we deserve. In the end, the house couldn't keep us. It couldn't break us. And now it's nothing more than a story about fear, resilience, and the strength of a family who refused to let the darkness win. It all started with a lead, a phone call, to be exact. Mark, a friend of mine who worked in the city archives, called me one day out of the blue. We hadn't talked in months, but his voice was urgent, almost nervous. "You ever hear about Ashwood Lane?" he asked. I hadn't. To me, it sounded like any other street, a small, unremarkable stretch of road that could be anywhere. But Mark said there was something strange about it. Over the past 20 years, at least 15 people had disappeared there. At first, I thought he was exaggerating. Disappearances happen, sure, but 15 on the same street. That didn't make sense. Then he said something that made my skin crawl. "The odd part," he said, "none of the disappearances were officially recorded. No missing persons reports, no news articles, nothing. It's like the street swallows them, and no one seems to care." I couldn't ignore it. Stories like this don't just fall into your lap. They're rare, the kind of mystery that could make your career if you could crack it. So I started digging. I pulled up city maps, scoured local forums, even checked old neighborhood directories. At first, it was frustrating. Ashwood Lane barely seemed to exist. It wasn't listed on most maps, and the few references I found were vague, as if people were trying to forget it. Then I found it. a faded blueprint of the neighborhood tucked away in a box of forgotten files. Ashwood Lane was there, but something about it looked wrong. The lines weren't as sharp as the other streets, as if it had been drawn and erased several times. Parts of the blueprint were smudged, almost intentionally, like someone didn't want it to stand out. That's when I realized Ashwood Lane wasn't supposed to exist. According to city records, the entire area had been slated for demolition decades ago. The official plan was to clear it out and redevelop the land. But for some reason it never happened. The neighborhood remained, hidden in plain sight, as if it had been forgotten by time itself. The more I looked into it, the stranger it got. There were no recent mentions of the street in the news, but the deeper I dug, the more unsettling the pieces became. And then I found it. An old police report, buried deep in the archives, dated 1973. It was written by a detective investigating a series of murders on Ashwood Lane. His notes described scenes straight out of a nightmare: bodies found in basements, walls stained with blood, and something else. The report mentioned strange symbols etched into the floors of several houses, symbols the detective couldn't explain. His writing became erratic toward the end, as if he was rushing to finish, or afraid of what might happen if he didn't. The final line sent chills down my spine. The house knows. The street devours. That was it. No arrests, no follow-ups. The case had been abandoned, sealed away like a secret no one wanted to talk about. I couldn't stop thinking about it. A forgotten street hidden from records, tied to unsolved murders and unexplained disappearances. It was too much to ignore. Part of me wanted to walk away, to forget I'd ever heard the name Ashwood Lane. But another part, the journalist in me, knew I had to see it for myself. I told myself it was just a story, just another assignment. But deep down I had a feeling this was different. I had no idea how right I was. I'll never forget the first time I saw Ashwood Lane. It wasn't just a street, it was a void. It felt wrong from the moment I turned onto it, like I had crossed an invisible line into somewhere I wasn't supposed to be. The houses were old and decaying, their windows shattered or boarded up. Weeds grew through the cracked pavement, tall enough to brush against my car as I drove. The air was thick, heavy, like the street itself was holding its breath. There wasn't a single person in sight. No kids playing, no cars parked along the curb. Just silence. Absolute unnatural silence. I parked my car at the edge of the street, too nervous to go any farther. Something about the place made my stomach churn. It was too quiet, too still. But I got out anyway, my camera slung over my shoulder. I told myself it was just another story, just another assignment. I was here to document, to observe. But the moment my feet touched the pavement, I felt it. The street wasn't empty. I couldn't see anyone, but I could feel eyes on me, watching, waiting. I should have gotten back in the car and driven away, but I didn't. Curiosity can be dangerous like that. I walked down the street, my camera in hand, snapping pictures of the abandoned houses. Each one told a story of neglect and decay. Doors hung off their hinges, revealing dark, empty interiors. Roofs sagged under the weight of time, threatening to collapse at any moment. Some houses were barely standing, their walls crumbling like sandcastles under the tide. But then I noticed something. One house didn't fit. It wasn't abandoned. It looked untouched. The windows were clean, the lawn neatly trimmed, and the front door was slightly open, as if inviting me in. I knew I should have turned back. Everything about this house screamed wrong. But curiosity got the better of me. It always does. The door opened easily, as if it had been waiting for me. Inside, the house was pristine. The floors gleamed, the furniture was neatly arranged, and the air smelled faintly of bleach. It felt like stepping into a time capsule. Everything was outdated, straight out of the 1970s. But it wasn't just the decor that felt off. It was the stillness. The house didn't feel empty. It felt occupied. That's when I heard it. Footsteps. They were faint, coming from upstairs, moving slowly from one room to the next. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. I told myself it was just the house settling, just an old building making noise. But deep down, I knew better. "Hello?" I called out, my voice shaking. The footsteps stopped. I stood there, staring at the staircase, willing myself to move, to leave. But my feet wouldn't budge. And then, the door slammed shut behind me. I grabbed the doorknob and yanked, but it wouldn't move. It was like it had been welded shut. The air grew heavier, colder, and I could feel the house closing in around me. The footsteps started again, louder this time, moving toward the top of the stairs. I didn't wait to see what was coming. I ran. I grabbed the doorknob and twisted as hard as I could, but it didn't move. It didn't even rattle. It was like the door had fused with the frame, sealed shut by something I couldn't see. Panic set in, cold and sharp, as my mind raced for an explanation. Maybe it was old and warped. Maybe the humidity had swollen the wood. But deep down, I knew that wasn't it. And then the whispers started. They came from everywhere and nowhere at once, crawling out of the walls, seeping through the floorboards. I couldn't understand the words, but the tone was clear, mocking, taunting, daring me to move. "What do you want?" I shouted, my voice cracking. But the whispers didn't answer. They just laughed. That's when I looked up. At the top of the stairs, standing perfectly still, was a figure. It wasn't like anything I'd ever seen. Its face was pale and featureless, as if someone had erased it entirely. It wore a long, tattered coat, the fabric stained with something dark and sticky, and its eyes, if you could even call them that, were empty, black voids that seemed to pull the light out of the room. It didn't move. It didn't speak. It just stared at me. My body froze. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but I couldn't. It was like the air around me had turned solid, trapping me in place. The figure took a step forward, its foot landing heavily on the creaking wood. That was all it took to break the spell. I turned and bolted for the back door, my heart hammering in my chest. I didn't care where it led, I just needed to get out. I ran through the hallway, past furniture that seemed to move in the corners of my vision. Every step felt heavier, like the house was trying to pull me back, to trap me inside. The back door was just ahead, but it felt so far away. I could hear the floorboards groaning behind me, the sound of footsteps that weren't mine chasing me down. I threw myself against the door, slamming my shoulder into the wood over and over. The whispers were everywhere now, circling me, closing in. And then, finally, the door gave way. It flew open and I stumbled into the backyard, the cold night air hitting me like a wave. I didn't stop running. The backyard was a mess of weeds and broken furniture, but I didn't care. I just kept moving, pushing through the darkness as the whispers followed me. I could feel it, the figure from the stairs watching me, its presence pressing against my back like a hand reaching out to grab me. I looked back at the house as I sped away. It was dark now, its windows lifeless, but I could still feel it watching me. The whispers faded as I drove, but they didn't disappear completely. They clung to me, echoing in my mind like a warning I didn't yet understand. I didn't stop driving until I was miles away. My hands were shaking, my chest tight, my mind racing to make sense of what I'd just seen. What was that figure? What were those whispers? I didn't have answers, but one thing was clear: Ashwood Lane wasn't just a street. It was a trap. And after my first visit to Ashwood Lane, I couldn't let it go. I told myself it was just curiosity, that I needed answers to make sense of what I'd seen. But the truth is, I was obsessed. That house, those whispers, that figure at the top of the stairs, they wouldn't leave me alone. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw it. Every time I sat in silence, I heard the whispers. So I did what I do best. I started digging. It didn't take long to realize that Ashwood Lane had a history, a long, dark history that no one wanted to talk about. The first clue came from a series of articles written in the 1940s. They mentioned a group called the Circle of Ashwood, a small but deeply secretive cult that operated out of one of the houses on the street. The articles were vague, almost as if the reporters were afraid to say too much. But what little they did say was enough to make my stomach turn. The Circle of Ashwood wasn't like any cult I'd ever heard of. They didn't recruit followers or preach about salvation. Their goal was darker, much darker. According to the articles, they believed in something they called the devouring. They thought they could trap people between worlds, binding their souls to a specific place, making them part of it. They called it a gift, a way to preserve someone forever. Their rituals were horrifying. The articles described small gatherings late at night, whispers that carried on the wind, and neighbors waking up to find people missing. But it wasn't just the disappearances. Witnesses claimed they heard screams coming from the houses, screams that seemed to echo even after they stopped. Some said they saw figures in the windows, pale, gaunt figures that didn't look entirely human. The deeper I dug, the worse it got. One article mentioned a woman who escaped the circle in 1943. She claimed they weren't just performing rituals, they were sacrificing people. The woman said she saw them carve symbols into the floors, symbols meant to open a doorway. She said the sacrifices weren't killed, they were erased. The article ended with a chilling quote, "The house devours." I couldn't stop thinking about that phrase. What did it mean? How could a house devour someone? And then I found the police report. It was dated 1973, 3 decades after the articles about the circle. A detective investigating a series of murders had written about finding bodies in basements, walls stained with blood, and strange symbols etched into the floors. The report mentioned a specific house on Ashwood Lane, but the address had been redacted. The last page of the report was different. The handwriting was messier, the sentences shorter, more frantic. It said, "The symbols are everywhere. The whispers won't stop. I can't stay here any longer." And then, scrawled at the bottom of the page, "The house knows." The report ended there. No arrests, no follow-ups, just a cryptic warning from a detective who clearly wanted nothing more to do with Ashwood Lane. I sat there in the library, surrounded by papers and photos, feeling like the walls were closing in. The more I learned, the less sense it made. Who were these people? What were they trying to do? And why was there no record of them after the 1970s? I didn't have answers, but I had a lead. The house they used for their rituals, the house where it all started, was still standing. And I knew I had to see it for myself. I sat in my car, the engine off, the world outside pitch black, except for the faint glow of the streetlights at the edge of Ashwood Lane. I had spent days combing through files, piecing together fragments of a story that didn't want to be told. What I found was a pattern, a chilling, undeniable pattern. Every 20 years, people disappeared from Ashwood Lane. It wasn't random. The victims were always tied to specific houses. The same addresses came up again and again, stretching back decades. It wasn't just bad luck or coincidence. It was deliberate. The street was alive, feeding on its residents, taking them one by one in some twisted, unrelenting cycle. And I had to find out why. I should have left it alone. Every instinct told me to turn the car around and forget I'd either heard of Ashwood Lane. But I couldn't. I needed to understand. I needed to know what was inside that house, the one where it all started. The house where the cult had lived, where the first disappearances happened, where the whispers began. So I stepped out of the car. I walked toward the street, my flashlight trembling in my hand. The houses loomed ahead, their dark shapes barely visible against the black sky. The first thing I noticed was the windows. They weren't broken or boarded up anymore. They were clean, pristine, glowing faintly as if there was light inside. It felt like the houses were watching me, waiting for me to take one step too far. I didn't know what I was expecting. Part of me hoped the street would look the same as before, abandoned, lifeless, empty. But this was worse. It felt alive, like the street had been waiting for me to return. Like it knew I couldn't stay away. Every step felt heavier, like the air was pressing down on me, making it harder to move. And then I saw the house. It was the same one I'd seen in the old police report, the one tied to the cult's rituals. It looked untouched, frozen in time. The paint was faded but unchipped, the door slightly ajar, as if it had been left open just for me. I stopped at the edge of the driveway, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. Every part of me wanted to turn back, to leave and pretend I'd never come here. But I couldn't. I needed to know what was inside. I needed to see it for myself. The door opened easily, swinging inward as if it had been waiting for me. Inside, the house was exactly as I imagined it. The furniture was old, worn and covered in dust, but everything was in its place. It was like stepping into a photograph from the 1940s. But it didn't feel abandoned. It felt occupied. I took a few steps inside, my flashlight flickering as I moved. The air was cold, colder than it should have been for a summer night. And then I heard it. A soft creak coming from upstairs. It wasn't loud, but it was deliberate. A single step followed by another. Slow. Measured. Tone. It felt like a warning. I froze, my flashlight trembling in my hand. I wanted to call out, to ask if someone was there, but the words caught in my throat. And then, the door at the end of the hallway creaked open. Just a crack, but enough to reveal the darkness inside. I knew I should have turned around. I knew I should have run. But something about that house wouldn't let me leave. It felt like it was pulling me in, like it wanted me to see something. And so I kept going. The house was worse than I remembered. The air felt heavier, pressing against my chest with every step I took. It wasn't just cold, it was suffocating, like the house itself didn't want me to breathe. The walls were covered in symbols now, carved deep into the wood and plaster. They pulsed faintly, like veins carrying some dark energy through the house. I didn't know what they meant, but I could feel their purpose. It wasn't good. I wanted to turn back, to run out the door and never come back. But something was pulling me deeper into the house. It wasn't curiosity anymore, it was something stronger. And then I saw it. At the far end of the hallway, hidden behind a broken door, was a staircase leading down into the basement. Every instinct screamed at me to turn around, but my feet kept moving step by step, down into the darkness. The air grew colder with every step, and the smell hit me: damp earth, decay, and something metallic like rusted iron. When I reached the bottom, I saw it. The basement was cold and damp, the floor slick beneath my feet. At the center of the room was a circle of symbols glowing faintly with an unnatural light. It felt wrong, like it didn't belong in this world. I stepped closer, my flashlight flickering as if the light itself didn't want to touch the circle. And that's when I saw them, shapes in the darkness, just beyond the edge of the light. They were the forgotten Ons. The people the cult had sacrificed, their souls bound to the house, to the street. Their faces were pale and stretched, their eyes empty hollows that seemed to pull you in. They moved toward me, slow but deliberate, their whispers overlapping until they became a single, distorted voice. You shouldn't have come back. My entire body froze. I wanted to move, to scream, to do anything, but I couldn't. Their voices, their hollow eyes, the way the air seemed to vibrate around them, it was like they were holding me in place. And then they reached out. I didn't think. I just ran. I turned and bolted for the stairs, the whispers chasing me, growing louder and angrier with every step. You can't leave, they hissed. You belong here. I could feel the shadows reaching for me, their cold fingers brushing against my back as I climbed the stairs 2 at a time. The house didn't want to let me go. The walls seemed to pulse and shift, the door at the top of the stairs swinging shut on its own. I threw myself against it, slamming my shoulder into the wood until it finally gave way. I stumbled into the hallway, but the shadows were right behind me. They poured up the stairs, filling the space like a dark tide. I don't know how I made it out, but somehow I did. I burst through the front door, the cold night air hitting me like a wave. I ran until I reached my car, my legs shaking, my chest tight with panic. But even as I slammed the door shut and sped away, I knew it wasn't over. The forgotten Ons weren't just bound to the house. They were bound to me now. I could feel it, their whispers still in my ears, their cold presence lingering in the back of my mind. I had escaped the house, but I knew I wasn't safe. Not yet. I thought I was free. When I ran out of that house, when I left Ashwood Lane behind, I truly believed it was over. I told myself I'd escaped, that the street couldn't hurt me anymore. But the truth, I was wrong. I was so wrong. When I got home, I tried to make sense of everything. I sat down at my desk, determined to write it all out, to put it into words so I could convince myself it was real and that it was over. But the moment I picked up the pen, the whispers started again. They weren't in the walls this time. They weren't coming from outside. They were in my head. I could hear them clearer than ever, overlapping voices speaking in a language I couldn't understand. But I didn't need to understand. I could feel their meaning. I wasn't alone. The shadows, they had followed me. They weren't bound to the house or the street. They were bound to me now. Everywhere I looked, they were there, just at the edge of my vision, waiting, watching. I never thought there would be a way out. For weeks after I left Ashwood Lane, the whispers haunted me. The shadows followed me, growing closer, bolder, until it felt like they'd consume me entirely. But sometimes the answers you need come from the most unexpected places. In my search for answers, I stumbled across something I hadn't seen before, an old journal, hidden in the archives where I'd first started my research. It belonged to one of the original members of the circle, someone who had tried to escape the cult before it all went too far. The journal explained everything: the rituals, the symbols, and most importantly, how to break the curse. The key wasn't to fight the curse. It was to acknowledge it, to confront it head on, to bring it into the light where it couldn't hide. The journal described a ritual that could sever the connection between the street and its victims, a way to free the souls trapped there, including mine. I followed the instructions exactly. Every line, every word, every detail had to be perfect. I didn't know if it would work, but I had to try. The journal said that the ritual wasn't about banishing the curse, it was about facing it, acknowledging what I'd seen, what I'd experienced, and taking back control. When the whispers started again, I didn't run. I didn't cover my ears or try to block them out. Instead, I listened. I let them wash over me, their voices chaotic and cruel. I let them remind me of the fear, the pain, the darkness. And then, I spoke. I told them I wasn't afraid anymore, that I understood what they were, and that they couldn't control me. I told them they didn't belong here, that their time was over. And then, the strangest thing happened. They stopped. For the first time in weeks, the room was quiet. The air felt clean. The shadows were gone. The whispers were gone. The weight that had pressed on my chest since Ashwood Lane was lifted. The curse was broken. I didn't just free myself that night. The journal said that breaking the ritual didn't just sever my connection to the street, it freed the others too. The forgotten Ons, the souls trapped by the circle's rituals, were finally released. For the first time in decades, Ashwood Lane was silent. I don't know what will happen to Ashwood Lane now. Maybe it will fade away, like it was supposed to all those years ago. As for me, I've moved on. But I'll never forget what happened there. The things I saw, the things I felt that are a part of me now. And maybe that's okay, because the darkness doesn't win when you run from it. It wins when you let it consume you. I chose to face it, and in doing so I found my way back to the light. It started like any other case. A missing girl, 22 years old, last seen leaving her apartment late at night. No signs of struggle, no witnesses, no leads. On paper, it sounded routine. A case that might stretch out for weeks, only to end up in a pile of cold files, forgotten by everyone but the people who loved her. Her name was Emily Carter, bright, ambitious, with a future that stretched out ahead of her like an open road. She was studying to be a journalist, the kind of person who chased stories no one else dared to touch. Her parents said she'd been consumed by something recently, a big story she wouldn't talk about. That alone made me pause. Journalists dig deep, and sometimes they unearth things that don't want to be found. The police weren't interested. They chalked it up to a runaway, a stressed college kid who'd gotten over her head and decided to disappear for a while. I wasn't so sure. There were too many little details that didn't add up. Her parents swore she'd never leave without telling them. Her friends said she wasn't acting like someone planning to vanish. And the timeline, it didn't sit right. Her last known location was her apartment. She'd left late, around 11 p.m., according to the building's security camera. But there was no footage of where she went. No one remembered seeing her after that. It was like she'd walked off the face of the earth. Her parents gave me access to her apartment. The police had already been through it, but I wanted to see it for myself. The moment I stepped inside, I knew something was off. Her room didn't feel like someone who planned to leave. The bed was unmade, her clothes scattered across the floor, normal, everyday chaos. But her laptop was open on her desk, the screen glowing faintly. Her notes were everywhere, covering the desk, the bed, even the floor. And then there were the drawings. In the corners of her notebooks, on scraps of paper, even on her wall calendar, this strange symbol, over and over again. A circle with jagged lines cutting through it, like a broken eye. It wasn't the kind of thing you doodle absent-mindedly. It felt deliberate, repeated, obsessive. I didn't know what it meant, but I knew it wasn't random. I flipped through her notebooks, hoping for answers. Instead, I found questions. The writing was messy, frantic. Phrases like "he's watching, it's coming for me," and "the witness knows" leapt out at me, scrawled in shaky handwriting. Emily was scared. That much was obvious. Her notes were a mix of cryptic warnings and half-finished thoughts, as if she'd been racing to put everything down before she ran out of time. Whatever she was working on, it wasn't just a story. It was something big. Big enough to make her believe she was being watched. I sifted through more of her things, looking for anything concrete. Old newspapers, printed emails, a voice recorder filled with hours of interviews, all of it pointed to something just out of reach, like the pieces of a puzzle with one key part missing. The last thing I found was a sticky note stuck to the back of her laptop. Written in capital letters, it said, "If I am gone, ITS, because I got too close." I stared at those words for a long time, the weight of them pressing down on me like a lead blanket. I had a bad feeling about this one. And I was right. I tracked down one of Emily's neighbors, a man named Gary, who lived across the hall. His name had come up in passing when I spoke to Emily's landlord, a recluse, barely paid his rent on time, but always home. If anyone saw Emily that night, it would have been him. Gary's apartment was what you'd expect from someone who lived alone and seemed to barely leave their place. The smell of stale smoke hung heavy in the air, mixing with the faint sourness of old takeout. Papers and magazines were stacked everywhere, forming precarious towers on the coffee table, the floor, even on top of the TV. He opened the door cautiously, peeking through the crack before letting me in. His bloodshot eyes darted back and forth like he was trying to see if anyone had followed me. "You're here about the girl, aren't you?" he asked, his voice low and scratchy. I nodded. Emily Carter. You saw her the night she disappeared." Gary lit a cigarette with shaky hands and motioned for me to sit on a couch that had seen better days. He leaned back in his chair, exhaling a long plume of smoke. "She was scared," he said finally, his voice soft. "Kept looking over her shoulder, like someone was following her." His words caught me off guard. "Following her? Did you see who it was?" He hesitated, his hand frozen mid-air as he brought the cigarette back to his lips. His eyes darted toward the corner of the room, where the shadows seemed to linger a little too long. "It wasn't a person," he said, barely above a whisper. "What do you mean, not a person?" I pressed. Gary didn't answer right away. Instead, he crushed the cigarette into an overflowing ashtray, his movements slow and deliberate. Finally, he looked at me, his face pale and lined with fear. "You won't believe me," he said. "Try me." Gary leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees, his voice dropping even lower. "It was a shadow. A shape. Like something was there, but not really there, you know. It followed her down the hallway that night, but when I looked, it was gone. Like it melted into the walls." I stared at him, trying to keep my expression neutral. "You're saying it wasn't human?" Gary nodded slowly. "Not exactly. I've seen it before, too, late at night. Out of the corner of my eye. It's always there, just watching." "Watching? Ah." He hesitated again, running a hand through his thinning hair. "They call it the witness," he muttered. That name hit me like a slap. It was the same phrase once seen scrawled in Emily's notebooks. "The witness," I repeated. "What does that mean?" Gary shook his head. "I don't know. I don't want to know. But whatever it is, it's not good. And now that you're asking about it, you should be careful." I pressed him for more details, but he climbed up, muttering excuses about needing to be alone. His hands trembled as he showed me to the door. "Do yourself a favor," he said as I stepped out into the hallway. "Drop this. Walk away. Nothing good comes from knowing too much." As I left, something about his apartment stuck with me. It wasn't just the clutter or the smell, it was the atmosphere. The way the light in the corner flickered faintly, casting shadows that didn't quite match the room's layout. And for a brief moment, as I turned to leave, I thought I saw something move across the wall. A shadow, faint and fleeting, like someone was standing just out of sight. I told myself it was nothing, a trick of the light. At the time, I thought Gary was just a paranoid old man, his mind warped by years of isolation and chain smoking. But his words stuck with me. The witness. It didn't make sense. Not yet. Emily had rented a storage unit a few weeks before she disappeared. It was a detail buried in her credit card statements, one the police had overlooked or ignored. Her parents didn't know why she'd rented it, and I wasn't sure either. But something told me whatever she'd been working on, the answers were in that unit. When I finally got the key from her parents, I wasn't sure what I'd find. I thought maybe it would be boxes of old school projects, books, or personal belongings she didn't have room for. But the moment I stepped inside, I knew this wasn't storage. It was something else entirely. The air inside was cold and damp, the kind of cold that sinks into your bones. The light from the single overhead bulb flickered faintly, casting uneven shadows on the concrete walls. The space was small, but it felt bigger somehow, as if it carried the weight of everything Emily had left behind. Pinned to the walls were dozens of notes, photographs, and maps, arranged like a makeshift investigation board. Strings connected pieces of information, tying together articles, handwritten notes, and printouts. In the center of it all was that same symbol. The circle with jagged lines cutting through it like a broken eye was drawn over and over again. It was on sticky notes, at the top of her journal pages, and even sketched onto the walls of the unit in what looked like charcoal. Emily had been tracking something or someone. Her notes were frantic, messy, barely coherent in places. Words and phrases leapt out at me as I scanned the pages. He's watching. The witness knows. They see without eyes. One photo pinned to the wall caught my attention. It was black and white, grainy, like it had been taken from a distance or through a dirty window. The image showed the doorway of an abandoned building. Standing in the doorway was a shadowy figure. The figure's face was obscured, but its outline wasn't natural. The edges were distorted, as if it was vibrating or shifting. The longer I looked at it, the more uneasy I felt. Emily had written a caption below the photo, "He always finds you." I turned back to the other papers, trying to piece together her thoughts. There were maps of the city with certain locations circled in red alleys. Abandoned buildings, forgotten corners of the city. Beneath each one, she'd written notes about disappearances and strange occurrences. It became clear that she wasn't just investigating a single event. She was uncovering a pattern, a thread that connected these places and the people who had vanished there. But the more I read, the more confusing it became. Some of her notes were cryptic, almost nonsensical. The shadows are the key. Don't look too long. The door opens for those who see. Others were chillingly specific. He follows at night. They disappear without a trace. They don't die, they're taken. It wasn't just fear driving her, it was desperation. She wasn't just researching, she was trying to protect herself. One article she'd pinned stood out. It was a decades-old report about a series of disappearances in the city. The victims all had one thing in common. They were last seen investigating strange phenomena. Journalists, private detectives, even curious neighbors. The article ended with a cryptic quote from an anonymous source. Some truths aren't meant to be uncovered. Once you see it, it sees you. My stomach sank as I realized Emily had likely stumbled onto something much bigger than she ever imagined. I kept going through the unit, finding more photos and sketches. In one of her journals, she described seeing the shadowy figure herself. It's not a man. It's not human. It doesn't move like us. It watches, waits, and when you see it, it knows you forever. Emily wasn't imagining things. She had been followed. The final piece I found was an old cassette tape. It was labeled simply with the words, "Don't listen alone." Against my better judgment, I played it. The tape was mostly static at first, but then faint sounds began to emerge. Whispers. Low, guttural voices, overlapping in a way that made it impossible to tell what they were saying. And then, a single clear voice broke through. "You've seen too much." I turned off the tape and stared at the recorder, my hands shaking. Emily had been tracking something real, something that didn't belong in our world. And now I was part of it. I stepped out of the storage unit, my mind racing, trying to make sense of what I'd seen. But as I locked the door behind me, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I told myself it was just my imagination, but deep down I knew better. Whatever Emily had uncovered, it wasn't done with her. And now it wasn't done with me. I followed the trail to an abandoned building on the outskirts of town. It was the same one from Emily's photos, the same crumbling structure she had circled on her maps. It wasn't hard to find anyone passing by would notice it, standing alone at the end of a dead-end road, surrounded by overgrown weeds and rusted fences. The place reeked of decay, the kind of smell that clings to you, sinking into your clothes and your skin. The air was thick, damp, and unnaturally cold, even for a structure left to rot. The outside of the building was covered in graffiti, layers upon layers of spray-painted tags and cryptic symbols. Most of it was the usual stuff: names, crude drawings, but scattered among the chaos was something else. That symbol again. The circle with jagged lines like a broken eye. It was everywhere. Carved into the concrete walls, painted on the ground, even scratched into the rusted doors. Some of the symbols were old, faded by time and weather, but others looked fresh, as if someone had been here recently. I hesitated at the entrance, my hand resting on the rusted metal door. Every instinct told me to turn around, to leave and never come back, but I couldn't. Emily had been here. This place was part of her story, and if I wanted to understand what had happened to her, I had to go inside. The door groaned loudly as I pushed it open, the sound echoing unnaturally in the stillness. The first thing I noticed was the silence. Not just an absence of noise, but a silence so profound it felt wrong, oppressive, like the building itself was holding its breath. My footsteps echoed loudly as I stepped inside, the sound bouncing off the cracked walls. The interior was as decayed as the outside: broken furniture, shattered glass, and piles of debris littered the floor. The walls were covered in peeling paint and more graffiti, but those symbols stood out among the clutter, their presence undeniable. Every step I took felt heavier, like the air around me was pushing back, resisting my intrusion. And then I heard it. Whispers. Faint, almost imperceptible, drifting through the air like a distant echo. I stopped, holding my breath, trying to pin the source, but it seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. I pressed on, moving deeper into the building. The hallway stretched ahead of me, lined with broken doorways and flickering shadows. My flashlight cut through the darkness, illuminating more of those symbols etched into the walls and floors. The whispers grew louder the further I went, their tone shifting from soft and distant to sharp and insistent. And then I found it. A room at the center of the building. It was empty except for a single chair in the middle of the floor and a mirror leaning against the far wall. The chair was old, its paint chipped and peeling, and the mirror's surface was cracked, the fractures spider-webbing across the glass. Something about the room felt wrong. The air was colder here, the silence heavier. It felt like stepping into another world, one that didn't welcome me. I approached the mirror cautiously, my flashlight trembling in my hand. My reflection stared back at me, but something was off. It wasn't moving the way I was. At first, I thought it was just my imagination, a trick of the light. But as I leaned closer, I realized it wasn't me. Its movements were slower, delayed, like it was mimicking me rather than reflecting me. And its eyes were hollow. Black voids that seemed to go on forever, pulling at me, drawing me in. The whispers grew louder, more urgent, overlapping into a chaotic cacophony that made my head throb. I stumbled back, my breath coming in shallow gasps. And then I saw it. Behind the cracks in the mirror, something moved. A shadowy figure, its shape shifting and indistinct, watching me from the other side of the glass. I ran. I didn't think. I didn't hesitate. I turned and bolted from the room, my footsteps pounding against the concrete as the whispers chased me, growing louder and angrier with every step. The hallway seemed longer now, stretching out endlessly as I ran. The symbols on the walls glowed faintly, pulsing like veins filled with fire. I could feel it behind me, its presence pressing against my back like a cold hand reaching out to pull me down. When I finally burst through the door and into the open air, I didn't stop. I didn't look back. I didn't know what I'd seen in that mirror, but I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't supposed to see it. And I wasn't alone. The whispers were still with me, faint but persistent, as I stumbled to my car. I could feel their weight in the back of my mind, like an itch I couldn't scratch. Whatever was in that building, whatever Emily had found, it wasn't done with me. Not yet. Back in my apartment, the chaos on my desk mirrored the chaos in my mind. Maps, photos, and Emily's frantic notes were spread out in a mess that I couldn't seem to organize. Her research was everywhere, decades worth of clippings and scraps she had pieced together into a mosaic of fear and obsession. A large map of the city dominated the desk. Pins marked locations across the city, alleys, parks, abandoned buildings. Each pin represented a disappearance. Each one a life snuffed out without a trace. I sat with my head in my hands staring at the map. The pins weren't random. They weren't scattered haphazardly. They formed a pattern. The deeper I dug, the more I realized Emily's disappearance wasn't an isolated event. It wasn't random. She had uncovered something far bigger, something terrifying. This wasn't the first time people had vanished like this. Every 10 years, like clockwork, the disappearances happened again. The victims were always the same type of person, young, curious, digging into things they shouldn't have. Journalists, investigators, researchers, all of them drawn to the same places, the same stories. And all of them vanished. Emily had traced these disappearances back decades, maybe longer. Each victim had stumbled onto something they weren't supposed to see, and every thread led back to that same symbol. The circle with jagged lines cutting through it. It wasn't just a mark. It wasn't some random doodle or graffiti. It was a warning. I flipped through Emily's notes, my hands trembling as I read her frantic handwriting. Words leapt off the page at me, phrases that felt like they were clawing their way into my mind. They're always watching. Don't look for too long. The witness knows. The more I read, the more the dread in my chest grew. Emily hadn't been paranoid. She hadn't imagined any of this. The missing people all had one thing in common. They had seen something they weren't supposed to. Emily called it the witness. She believed it wasn't a person. It wasn't human. It was a force, something ancient, something alive and bound to that symbol. She thought it needed people to see it, to acknowledge it. That's how it claimed them. Once you noticed it, once you saw it for what it was already too late. And now it had claimed me. The evidence was all around me. I had followed her path, stepped into the same places she had gone, and stared too long at the same things she had uncovered. I flipped through a stack of newspaper clippings, my pulse pounding in my ears. Words like missing, unsolved, and unknown stood out in bold, black print, as if they were screaming at me. The victims' faces stared back at me from grainy photos, their eyes wide with hope and naivety that now felt cruelly ironic. Emily had been right. These weren't random crimes, they were part of something bigger. I looked back at the map, my eyes tracing the pattern of the pins. The locations seemed to pulse with an unseen energy, their significance weighing on me like an invisible hand pressing down on my chest. And then I noticed something I hadn't seen before. At the center of the pattern, surrounded by the web of pins and disappearances, was a single location. One I hadn't thought to investigate yet. It wasn't an alley or a park or an abandoned building. It was an old church. Emily had circled it in red, her handwriting scrawled beside it, the beginning and the end. My breath caught in my throat. I didn't know what she meant, but I had a sickening feeling that whatever was waiting there, it wasn't something I wanted to see. My phone vibrated on the desk, snapping me out of my thoughts. The screen showed an unknown number. I hesitated, my hand hovering over the phone. Every instinct screamed at me not to answer, but I needed answers. I needed to know. I picked up the phone, my voice shaky as I said, "Hello." For a moment there was nothing but static on the other end. Then a voice broke through. It was low and distorted, layered with faint whispers that overlapped and twisted into an unnatural harmony. "It's watching you." The line went dead. I stared at the phone, my heart racing, my mind reeling. I didn't know who or what had just called me, but I knew one thing for certain. I wasn't safe. Not anymore. That voice, I don't know how to describe it. It wasn't human. It wasn't even close. It was like 1,000 whispers layered together, crawling into my ears and clawing at my mind. Each word felt like it carried weight, pressing against my skull, making it impossible to think straight. I sat there at my desk, staring at the phone in my hand, replaying the distorted words over and over in my head. "It's watching you." I told myself it was a prank. Someone trying to mess with me, maybe someone who had heard I was working on Emily's case. My imagination was running wild, that's all. But deep down, I knew the truth. It was here. The room felt different. The kind of quiet that doesn't feel natural, like the world itself was holding its breath. Even the wind outside seemed to fade, leaving nothing but the hum of the desk lamp flickering weakly beside me. The shadows on the walls caught my attention. At first I thought it was just the lamp, the unsteady light making them shift and ripple. But the longer I stared, the more I realized they weren't moving with the light. They were moving on their own. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The shadows stretched unnaturally, their edges sharp and deliberate. They moved across the walls, slow and deliberate, as if they were alive. At first, I told myself I was imagining it. A trick of the light, my overworked brain conjuring things that weren't there. But then one of them detached. It peeled itself from the wall, its dark form stretching toward me, slow and deliberate. My flashlight was on the desk. I grabbed it and shone it toward the corner of the room, but the beam did nothing. The shadow didn't dissipate. It didn't fade. It just kept moving closer, like the light didn't exist at all. The whispers started again. They weren't coming from the phone this time. They were coming from everywhere. Low and guttural, overlapping, crawling over one another in a chorus of incoherent sounds. I wanted to run. My brain screamed at me to get up, to leave, to get out of that room. But my legs wouldn't move. It was like the air around me had turned to concrete, holding me in place. The shadows kept coming, closing in on all sides. The whispers grew louder, filling my ears, pressing against my mind like they were trying to break something inside me. And then I saw it. In the corner of the room, something stood. At first, it was just a dark shape, vague and formless. But as I stared, it began to take shape, its outline twisting and shifting like liquid trying to solidify. Its eyes, if you could call them, that were hollow, glowing faintly in the darkness. It tilted its head, the movement unnatural and sharp, like a puppet on strings, and then it spoke. Its voice broke through the whispers, low and guttural, cutting through the noise like a knife. "You see me. You're mine." It was the witness. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to move, to run, to do something, anything, to get away. But I couldn't. The weight of the air, the sound of the whispers, the hollow gaze of that thing in the corner, it all held me there, frozen. I don't know how I did it, but somehow I broke free. One moment I was sitting at the desk, staring into the void of its eyes. The next I was on my feet, stumbling toward the door. The shadows clawed at me as I moved, their edges sharp and cold, leaving trails of ice across my skin. The whispers screamed in my ears, louder and angrier, like they were trying to drag me back. I threw open the door and bolted into the hallway. I didn't stop to grab anything. I didn't even look back. I ran down the hallway of my apartment building, my footsteps echoing against the walls. I could feel the shadows behind me, pouring out from under the door like a tide, chasing me. I glanced over my shoulder once, and I wished I hadn't. The hallway was filled with them, the darkness surging forward, twisting and writhing, their hollow eyes locked onto me. My breath came in short, panicked gasps as I reached the stairs and practically threw myself down them, stumbling and catching myself against the railing. I didn't stop running until I was outside, the cold night air hitting me like a slap to the face. But even then, I didn't feel safe. I looked back at the building, expecting to see the shadows pouring out after me, but the windows were dark, lifeless. It was like nothing had happened. But I knew better. I knew it wasn't over. The witness had seen me. And now, I was it. I thought I could get away. I thought if I left, if I drove far enough, it couldn't follow me. But I was wrong. I sat in my car, parked in a desolate lot miles from anywhere familiar. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles were white. My shirt clung to my back, soaked with sweat, and my breathing came in short, panicked bursts. Outside, the night was pitch black. No streetlights, no distant glow of a city skyline, just darkness pressing in from every side. And then there were the whispers. At first they were faint, just barely audible over the sound of the wind. I told myself they were in my head, that they weren't real. But as the minutes passed, they grew louder, more distinct. Low and guttural, layered and overlapping, like 100 voices all speaking at once. It didn't matter how far I drove. It didn't matter how fast I went. The whispers were always there, just out of reach, wrapping around me like an invisible chain. The shadows, too. I could see them moving in the corners of my vision. They flickered and danced, stretching unnaturally along the dashboard and across the windows. Every time I turned to look, they were gone, but I knew they were there. There was no escaping it. I glanced at the passenger seat, where Emily's notebook sat open. The pages were filled with her frantic handwriting, and that same symbol, the broken eye, was scrawled over and over again. It felt like it was staring at me, mocking me. "Leave me alone," I muttered, my voice shaking as I grabbed the notebook and hurled it onto the floor. It landed face down, but the whispers didn't stop. If anything, they grew louder. It didn't matter what I did. It didn't matter where I went. The witness had seen me, and now it wouldn't stop until I was part of it. I stared at the rearview mirror, my own pale, sweat-soaked face staring back at me. The darkness outside the car was impenetrable, like a void. I kept telling myself I was alone, that the whispers were in my head, that I could still outrun whatever this was. But then, in the mirror, I saw it. At first, it was just a faint blur, a shadow that didn't belong. But as I watched, it grew clearer. A figure. It sat in the back seat, its outline vague and shifting, like smoke trying to take shape. Its eyes hollow and glowing, faintly locked onto mine through the mirror. My blood turned to ice. I whipped around, my heart hammering in my chest, but the back seat was empty. The whispers exploded into a cacophony, so loud it felt like they were inside my skull. I clutched my head, trying to drown them out, but they only grew louder, their words still incomprehensible but filled with malice. Once you see it, it never lets go. Emily knew that. She had tried to warn me in her notes, in her research. She had left breadcrumbs, hoping someone would understand before it was too late. But it wasn't enough. When I came to, the world around me was silent. The whispers were gone, replaced by a suffocating stillness. I was still in my car, the engine idling softly, the headlights illuminating an empty stretch of road. My hands were no longer on the wheel, but resting limply in my lap. They felt heavy, like they didn't belong to me. For a long time, I just sat there, staring out into the darkness. I didn't know how much time had passed, but something felt different off. The weight in my chest was still there, pressing down like a stone. My thoughts were fragmented, disjointed, slipping through my fingers like sand. I tried to piece together what had happened, but the more I thought about it, the more it slipped away. The notebook was back on the passenger seat. I don't remember putting it there. Its cover was closed, the edges frayed and smudged with dirt, but it was unmistakably Emily's. The symbol was etched into the cover, deeper and darker than before, like it had been burned into the leather. I reached out to touch it, my fingers brushing the surface. The air around me grew colder, the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. I didn't want to open it, but something inside me said I had to. My hands moved on their own, flipping the cover open to the first page. The frantic scribbles I'd seen before were gone, replaced by a single sentence, written neatly in bold, precise letters. "You are the witness now." The words burned into my mind, sinking deep into the parts of me that still clung to reason. I didn't understand what they meant, but I didn't need to. I could feel it. Something had changed. The shadows outside the car seemed closer now, stretching longer and darker than they should. The trees lining the road loomed impossibly tall, their branches twisting in unnatural patterns. And in the rearview mirror, I caught a glimpse of something. It wasn't a figure this time, not exactly. It was a shape, indistinct and shifting, hovering just out of focus. It didn't move, didn't breathe, but its presence filled the car like a living thing. I couldn't bring myself to turn around. I gripped the steering wheel tightly, my knuckles white, and pressed the gas pedal. The car lurched forward, the headlights cutting through the darkness. I didn't know where I was going. I just knew I couldn't stay. The road stretched out endlessly ahead of me, an unbroken line of asphalt disappearing into the void. My headlights caught glimpses of the trees, the grass, the empty expanse of night. But no matter how far I drove, the feeling didn't leave. It wasn't just the whispers or the shadows or the cold, creeping dread that clung to my skin. It was the sense that I wasn't alone. Not anymore. The farther I went, the clearer it became I hadn't escaped. I never could. I gripped the wheel tighter, my breath coming in shallow gasps. The road blurred before my eyes, the darkness pressing in closer with every mile. And then, as if it had always been there, a shape appeared on the road ahead. It was tall and still, its outline barely visible against the night. Its hollow eyes glowed faintly, the only light in the suffocating blackness. I slammed the brakes, the tires screeching against the pavement. The car skidded to a stop, the headlights washing over the figure. It didn't move. I stared at it, my heart pounding in my chest, my hands frozen on the wheel. The air around me felt heavy, suffocating, as if the world itself had stopped. And then slowly it tilted its head. I closed my eyes, unable to look anymore, and gripped the wheel tighter. My breath was shallow, my thoughts spinning, unraveling, breaking apart. When I opened my eyes again, the road was empty. The figure was gone, but its presence lingered, etched into the darkness like a scar. I didn't start the car again. I didn't move. I just sat there, staring into the void, waiting for the inevitable. I thought it was over. I thought I could drive away, leave it behind, and start over. But no matter where I went, no matter how far I ran, it was always there. The whispers, low, guttural, crawling into the corners of my mind when I thought I was alone. The shadows, moving when they shouldn't, stretching too far, flickering in places where there was no light. And the feeling that something was watching me, always watching. I couldn't escape it. No amount of distance, no amount of time could erase what I had seen or what had seen me. Running wasn't the answer. It never was. I tried to ignore it at first. I told myself that if I pretended it wasn't real, if I acted like none of it had happened, maybe it would go away. But it didn't. It got worse. The whispers grew louder, more insistent. The shadows pressed closer, curling around me like invisible hands. And the feeling, that awful, suffocating feeling, never left. I couldn't sleep. I couldn't think. I couldn't live like that anymore. If I wanted to survive, if I wanted my life back, I had to confront it. I didn't know what I was up against. I didn't know if I could stop it, or if it could even be stopped. But I knew I had to try. This is the story of how I found the truth, and how I put an end to it. Or at least I tried. I didn't have a choice. Everything, the whispers, the symbols, the fear, led me back to one place, Ashwood Lane. I'd spent weeks running, hiding, trying to convince myself that there was a way out, that I could escape. But I couldn't. Every piece of evidence, every unanswered question, every gut instinct pulled me back to that cursed street. I'd heard the stories, read the warnings, and seen firsthand what it could do. But if there was any chance of breaking free, I had to go back. I had to understand what the witness was, and I had to destroy it. Returning to Ashwood Lane felt like walking into a nightmare. The street was just as I remembered it, dark, oppressive, and unnaturally quiet. The air hung heavy, thick with an energy that made it hard to breathe. The building was still there, standing at the end of the street like a sentinel, but it looked different now. It was less decayed, more intact, as if the time I'd spent away had given it life. The walls seemed taller, the windows darker, and the symbols, they were everywhere. They were brighter now, etched into every surface, glowing faintly in the dim light. The circle with jagged lines cut through it, the broken eye was carved into the walls, the floors, even the door frame. The moment I stepped inside, the air grew colder. Walking through that building again felt like stepping into a trap. The walls seemed closer, the hallways darker. Every step echoed unnaturally, like the building itself was listening. But this time I wasn't just a victim. I had a plan. I'd spent days poring over Emily's research, her notes, her warnings. She believed the witness was tied to this place, that it drew its power from the symbols. If I could destroy them, maybe I could weaken it. Maybe I could end it for good. I moved through the building cautiously, my flashlight cutting through the darkness. The symbols seemed to pulse faintly as the beam passed over them, as if they were alive, responding to my presence. I started with the walls. Using the edge of a metal pipe I'd picked up outside, I scratched at the symbols, gouging them out of the plaster. The glowing lines faded with each strike, the air growing heavier with every symbol I destroyed. The whispers started almost immediately. At first they were faint, barely audible over the sound of the pipe scraping against the walls. But as I continued, they grew louder, more frantic. The shadows in the corners of the room began to move, flickering and stretching unnaturally. It fought back. I whispered to myself, my breath catching as I turned to the next wall. The whispers became screams, overlapping voices filled with anger and malice. The shadows lashed out, clawing at the edges of my vision, pressing against me like a living thing. My hands shook as I worked, the metal pipe slipping in my grasp. Every swing felt heavier, every movement slower, as if the air itself was fighting me. But I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. The glass etched with symbols was next. I smashed it with the pipe, the sound shattering the oppressive silence. Shards rained down onto the floor, catching the faint glow of the symbols as they faded into nothing. The room shuddered, the walls groaning as if in pain. I moved deeper into the building, scratching out symbols, smashing glass, tearing down anything that bore the mark of the witness. With every strike, the whispers grew louder, more frantic, more desperate. The shadows thickened, pressing in closer, their edges sharp and cold. They clawed at my mind, filling it with images I didn't want to see: Emily's terrified face, the hollow eyes of the witness, and the endless void that waited just beyond the edge of the darkness. For a moment, I faltered. The weight of it all, the fear, the exhaustion, the overwhelming presence of the witness threatened to pull me under. But then I remembered Emily. Her notes, her warnings, her desperation. She hadn't given up, even when she knew what was coming for her. And I wouldn't either. I drove the pipe into the final wall, shattering the last of the symbols. The room fell silent. The shadows recoiled, pulling back into the corners. The whispers faded, replaced by a heavy, oppressive stillness. For a moment, I thought I'd done it. But deep down, I knew this wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. The symbols weren't enough. Destroying them in the building on Ashwood Lane had done something. I could feel it. The air felt lighter, the shadows less oppressive. But the whispers hadn't disappeared entirely. They lingered, faint and distant, like an echo that refused to fade. Emily's notes pointed to something deeper, a source. The church. A church. It had been there for decades, maybe longer. Hidden away on the outskirts of the city, buried under layers of history and neglect. It wasn't just a building. It was where it all started. It was where the witness was born. The road to the church was long and overgrown, flanked by gnarled trees that reached out like skeletal hands. The air grew colder the closer I got, the kind of cold that didn't come from the weather. It sank into my skin, into my bones. When I finally saw it, I stopped the car. The church loomed in the distance, its silhouette stark against the darkened sky. It was ancient, its stone walls cracked and crumbling, its windows shattered. Ivy had consumed most of the structure, twisting and tangling over the stone like veins. But even from a distance, I could see them. The symbols. The symbols. They covered the walls, glowing faintly in the darkness. The same broken eye symbol I'd seen over and over again, etched into every surface. It was as if the church itself had been branded, marked by whatever force had claimed it. I stepped out of the car, the sound of my boots crunching against the gravel loud in the unnatural silence. Everything led here. The church wasn't just a place of worship, it was a gateway. Emily believed the witness had been summoned here, tied to this spot through rituals and sacrifices. This wasn't just a place where it existed, it was where it thrived, where it drew its power. If I could close the gateway, maybe I could sever its connection to this world. Maybe I could end it. The door creaked loudly as I pushed it open, the sound echoing unnaturally through the empty space. Inside, the air was thick, heavy with an energy that made it hard to breathe. The walls were covered in more symbols, glowing faintly in the dim light. Candles surrounded the room, their flames flickering unnaturally, casting long, dancing shadows that seemed to move on their own. At the center of the room was the altar. It was made of dark stone, its surface cracked and worn. Symbols were carved into the stone, their edges sharp and precise. I stepped closer, my flashlight flickering as I approached. Everything about the room felt wrong. The air grew colder with every step, the oppressive silence broken only by the faint sound of my own breathing. And then the whispers returned. They were louder now, sharper, more insistent. They seemed to come from everywhere, overlapping voices that twisted and distorted, speaking in a language I couldn't understand. I reached the altar, my hands trembling as I placed Emily's notes on its surface. This was it. The moment everything had been leading to. I started scratching out the symbols on the altar, using the edge of a blade I'd brought with me. The whispers grew louder, more frantic, as if they knew what I was trying to do. The room began to shake, the candles flickering wildly. The shadows on the walls stretched and twisted, their edges sharp and jagged. And then I saw it. A figure appeared in the shadows, its hollow eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. It was the witness. It didn't move at first, just stood there, watching me. Its form was vague, shifting, like smoke trying to take shape. But its eyes were fixed on me, burning with an intensity that made my chest tighten. It was waiting for me. This time I didn't run. I couldn't. I had one chance, and I wasn't going to waste it. I recited the incantations Emily had found in her research, my voice shaking with every word. The symbols on the altar began to fade, their glow dimming as I scratched them out. The room shook violently, the air growing colder and heavier with each passing second. The witness stepped closer, its movements slow and deliberate. The whispers turned to screams, the shadows lashing out, clawing at my mind, my body. It felt like the air itself was pressing against me, trying to crush me. But I didn't stop. Every word felt like a fight, every movement a battle. The shadows closed in, the whispers screamed in my ears, but I kept going. And then it stopped. The altar cracked, a sharp, deafening sound that echoed through the room. The symbols faded completely, their glow snuffed out like a flame. The figure of the witness flickered, its form distorting and breaking apart. Its hollow eyes locked onto mine one last time before it vanished, dissolving into the darkness. The room fell silent. The oppressive weight lifted, the air growing still and calm. For the first time in weeks, the whispers were gone. The shadows were still, and I could breathe. I didn't know if it was over. I didn't know if I'd truly destroyed it or if I'd just delayed the inevitable. But in that moment, standing in the empty church, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't felt in a long time. It was quiet. And for now, that was enough. Destroying the altar didn't bring Emily back. It didn't bring back any of the others. The names and faces I'd pieced together from newspaper clippings and faded photographs, the young journalists, the investigators, the curious souls who stumbled too close to the truth, they were still gone. But destroying the altar gave me something else. It gave me a chance to live. I left the city not long after that night. I didn't pack much, just a bag of clothes, a few essentials, and Emily's notebook. I couldn't bring myself to leave it behind, even though looking at it filled me with dread. I drove for hours, watching the city shrink in my rearview mirror until it was nothing but a distant memory. I stayed away from Ashwood Lane. I stayed away from anything that reminded me of it. I changed my name, moved to a small, quiet town where no one asked questions, a place where I could start over. At first, it felt like freedom. The symbols were gone. The whispers were gone. But the memories lingered. Every shadow made me pause. Every sound in the dark made my heart race. The creak of a floorboard, the rustle of leaves, the faint hum of an old fluorescent light, they all brought me back to that moment, standing in the church, staring into the hollow eyes of the witness. I learned to live with it, though. The fear, the paranoia, it became a part of me, something I carried like a scar. Life in the small town was quiet. I found work at a bookstore, spent my days stocking shelves and chatting with customers who didn't know me, didn't know my past. I told myself I was safe. But some nights when the store was empty and the light cast long shadows across the floor, I'd feel it. That weight. That presence. It was faint, like a distant echo, but it was there. I told myself it was my imagination, the scars of what I'd been through playing tricks on me. But deep down, I knew better. Emily once wrote that some truths aren't meant to be uncovered. She was right. If I could go back, if I could undo everything I'd done, following the clues, walking into that building, scratching out those symbols, I would. But I had to try. I had to know. Oh, maybe I didn't destroy the witness. Maybe it's still out there, waiting for someone else to find it. Waiting for another curious soul to stumble onto Ashwood Lane. I think about that sometimes, about the next person who might uncover the symbols, follow the whispers, walk into the trap. But for now, it's quiet. And that's enough. I sit on my porch most evenings now, watching the sun dip below the horizon, the sky turning shades of gold and orange before fading into the dark. The darkness doesn't scare me as much as it used to, but I still keep a light on, just in case.